Working the ER night shift, you see a lot of strange things, but this week something happened that I can't explain. My name is Jennifer Walsh. Last Tuesday, I treated 17 people with severe burns from a fire that happened 50 years before I was born. They arrived in our ER wearing clothes from the 1970s, asking for doctors who died decades ago, carrying identification cards that should have crumbled to dust. But here's the thing. I was the only one who could see that something was wrong. To everyone else, they looked like normal burn victims from a normal house fire. But I could smell the smoke of a different time, hear them talking about medical procedures that haven't been used in 50 years, see the terror in their eyes as they realized no one could help them. What I discovered about these patients led me to uncover the most horrific medical cover-up in our hospital's history. And it taught me that some crimes are so terrible, the dead will keep returning until justice is served. This is the story of how I learned that my own grandmother was murdered to hide a secret, and how 47 souls waited 50 years for someone to finally tell the truth. But I need to warn you, what I found in our hospital's buried records will make you question every medical institution you've ever trusted. Because sometimes, the dead don't rest in peace. Sometimes, they come back to work. Before I tell you about the night I treated patients from 1973, you need to understand who I am and why this story matters. My name is Jennifer Walsh, and I'm an ER nurse at Memorial Hospital in Denver, Colorado. I've been working emergency medicine for 7 years. I've seen every kind of trauma, every type of burn injury, every way a human body can be damaged by fire. Memorial Hospital has been serving Denver for over 60 years. The current building was constructed in 1974, after the original hospital was destroyed in a devastating fire on March 15, 1973. According to official records, 47 people died in that fire: patients, visitors, and medical staff who couldn't escape in time. The new Memorial Hospital was built as a tribute to those who were lost, with state-of-the-art fire safety systems and emergency protocols designed to ensure that such a tragedy could never happen again. I grew up hearing stories about the 1973 fire. My grandmother, Louise Walsh, had been a patient in the original hospital when it burned down. According to my family, she died in the fire while recovering from routine surgery. Her death was what inspired me to become a nurse. I wanted to help people the way the medical staff tried to help her. But what I didn't know was that almost everything I'd been told about the 1973 fire was a lie. Memorial Hospital is a busy Level 2 trauma center. We handle everything from car accidents to industrial injuries to house fires. Denver has its share of emergencies, especially during the dry season when wildfires threaten the outskirts of the city. In my 7 years working here, I've treated hundreds of burn victims. I know what fresh burns look like, how they smell, how victims behave in the immediate aftermath of fire trauma. I know which injuries come from house fires, which come from car accidents, which come from industrial accidents. I thought I knew everything about burn injuries. But last Tuesday night, I encountered burn victims unlike any I'd ever seen. The first sign that something was wrong was the smell. When you work in an ER, you become familiar with the distinct odors associated with different types of trauma. Fresh burns have a specific smell, a mixture of charred skin, melted synthetic materials, and the acrid smoke that clings to victims' clothing and hair. But the patients who arrived last Tuesday night smelled different. They smelled like old smoke. Not smoke from a recent fire, but smoke that had been lingering for decades. Mixed with that was an underlying odor I couldn't identify. Something chemical, medical, almost pharmaceutical. The second sign was their clothing. Modern fire victims arrive wearing contemporary clothing, polyester blends, synthetic fabrics, materials that melt and fuse to skin in characteristic patterns. But these patients were wearing clothing that looked like it belonged in a museum. Natural fibers, outdated cuts, styles I recognized from old photographs. The third sign was their behavior. Fire victims are typically in shock, disoriented, asking about family members or concerned about property damage. These patients were asking about doctors who hadn't worked at Memorial Hospital in decades. They were requesting medical procedures that we'd stopped using years ago. They seemed confused about basic aspects of modern medical care. But the strangest thing was that none of my colleagues seemed to notice any of these inconsistencies. Dr. Sarah Chen, our attending that night, treated these patients as if they were completely normal burn victims from a completely normal house fire. When I tried to point out the oddities, the outdated clothing, the unusual requests, the strange smell, Dr. Chen looked at me like I was imagining things. "Jennifer, they're standard burn victims," she said with concern. "Are you feeling all right? You seem distracted tonight." I started to doubt my own perceptions. Maybe I was seeing things that weren't there. Maybe the stress of working consecutive night shifts was affecting my judgment. But then I started paying closer attention to what the patients were saying, and that's when I realized these weren't recent fire victims. They were the victims of a fire that had happened 50 years ago, and somehow they had returned to finish business that had been left undone. The first patient who made me question reality was a woman named Dorothy Martinez. She was brought in around 11 p.m. with second and third degree burns covering approximately 30% of her body. As I was cleaning her wounds and starting IV fluids, Dorothy grabbed my hand with surprising strength. "Nurse," she said urgently, "I need you to find Dr. Harrison. He needs to know about the experiment. He needs to know what they were doing to us." "Ma'am, there's no Dr. Harrison on staff here," I told her gently, "but Dr. Chen is taking excellent care of you." Dorothy looked confused and frightened. "Dr. Harrison has to be here. This is Memorial Hospital, isn't it? I was in the experimental wing when the fire started." "Memorial Hospital doesn't have an experimental wing," I said. "And I'm sorry, but I don't know any Dr. Harrison." "But he's the head of research," Dorothy insisted. "He's been giving us the new medication. He promised it would help with my condition." I checked Dorothy's chart. According to the ambulance crew, she'd been brought in from a house fire on Elm Street. There was no mention of any experimental treatment or research program. But Dorothy's injuries troubled me. The burn patterns didn't match what I'd expect from a typical house fire. They were too uniform, too systematic, almost like they'd been applied in a controlled environment. The second patient was even more disturbing. James Patterson, 63 years old, severe burns on his hands and arms. As I was treating him, he kept asking about his wife. "Has anyone called Margaret?" he asked repeatedly. "She'll be worried sick. We were supposed to go to our son's graduation tomorrow." I assured him that the hospital would contact his family, but James became increasingly agitated. "You don't understand," he said. "Tommy's graduating from high school tomorrow. It's 1973. We can't miss it." I felt my blood go cold. "Sir, what year do you think it is?" "It's March 1973, James said with absolute certainty. "March 15th. I remember because it's the Ides of March, and Margaret always jokes about that being a bad luck day." March 15th, 1973, the exact date of the Memorial Hospital fire. I tried to remain professional, but my hands were shaking as I continued treating James's burns. "Mr. Patterson, I need to ask you something. Do you remember how you got these burns?" "From the fire, of course. It started in the research wing and spread so fast. The alarms were going off, but the doors wouldn't open. It was like someone had locked us in." "Locked you in where?" "In the experimental ward. Dr. Harrison had us all there for the trial. He said we were helping advance medical science." I excused myself and went to find Dr. Chen. "Doctor, I need to ask you about the patients from the fire tonight. Are you sure they're from the Elm Street incident?" Dr. Chen looked at her tablet. "Absolutely. Multiple casualties from a residential fire." "Why?" "Because they're talking about events from 1973. They seem to think it's 50 years ago." "Jennifer, fire victims often experience disorientation and confusion. Head injuries, smoke inhalation, psychological trauma, all of these can affect memory and perception of time." Dr. Chen's explanation made sense medically, but it didn't explain why all the patients seemed to be confused about the exact same time period. The third patient confirmed my worst fears. Louise Walsh, 74 years old, severe burns over 40% of her body. When I saw the name on her chart, I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. Louise Walsh was my grandmother's name, but my grandmother had died in 1973. I approached the patient's bedside with trembling hands. The woman lying there looked exactly like my grandmother had in the old photographs I'd seen. The same face, the same hair, even the same jewelry she'd been wearing in the last picture taken before her death. "Excuse me," I said carefully. "What's your full name?" "Louise Marie Walsh," she replied. "I was a patient here for gallbladder surgery." Dr. Harrison moved me to the research wing for some kind of additional treatment. What kind of treatment? He said it was experimental medication that would help me heal faster. But something went wrong. The other patients started getting sicker instead of better, and then the fire started. Louise grabbed my hand and looked directly into my eyes. You look familiar, dear. What's your name? Jennifer Walsh. Louise's eyes widened. Walsh? Are you related to the Walsh family from Denver? I could barely speak. Louise Walsh was my grandmother. I am Louise Walsh, she said with growing excitement. And if you're Jennifer Walsh, then you must be... But that's impossible. My son Robert doesn't have any children yet. Robert Walsh was my father's name. I was looking at my own grandmother, 50 years after she had died in the Memorial Hospital fire. But she wasn't just a ghost or a spirit. She was a patient, with real burns, real pain, real medical needs. And she had no idea that 50 years had passed since the fire that killed her. As I stood beside her bed, trying to process what was happening, I heard Dr. Chen calling for all available staff. We have 14 more burn victims incoming, she announced. House fire with multiple casualties. ETA 3 minutes. 14 more patients from a fire that had happened 50 years ago. And I was beginning to understand that this wasn't a coincidence. These patients hadn't just returned randomly. They had come back for a reason. And somehow that reason was connected to me. After treating 17 patients from what I was becoming convinced was the 1973 Memorial Hospital fire, I knew I needed answers. But I also knew that no one would believe me if I tried to explain what I was seeing. During my break at 4 a.m., I went to the hospital's medical library and accessed the archived records from the original Memorial Hospital. What I found made my hands shake as I read. The official report on the March 15, 1973, fire stated that the blaze had started in the hospital's electrical system and spread rapidly throughout the building. 47 people had died, including patients, visitors, and medical staff. But as I dug deeper into the records, I found inconsistencies that raised serious questions about the official story. First, the fire had started in what was listed as the Special Research Wing, a section of the hospital that wasn't mentioned in any of the architectural plans or public documentation. Second, all of the patients who died in the fire had been moved to this research wing in the days immediately before the fire, ostensibly for specialized treatment. Third, the hospital's insurance claim listed damages to experimental medical equipment worth over $2 million, an enormous sum for 1973, and equipment that wasn't mentioned in any public records. I found a list of the fire victims, and every single patient I had treated that night was on that list. Dorothy Martinez, James Patterson, Louise Walsh, all of them had officially died 50 years ago. But the most disturbing discovery came when I found a folder marked Confidential Research Files, Dr. Edward Harrison, Chief of Experimental Medicine. Inside were documents that made me sick to my stomach. Memorial Hospital had been conducting illegal human experimentation on patients without their knowledge or consent. Dr. Harrison had been testing experimental pharmaceuticals on patients who thought they were receiving standard medical treatment. The drugs were designed to enhance healing, but many of them had severe side effects, including organ failure, neurological damage, and death. According to the documents, by early 1973, several patients had died from the experimental treatments, and others were experiencing severe complications. Hospital administration had become aware of the illegal research and was planning to shut down Dr. Harrison's program and report him to federal authorities. But before that could happen, the research wing had mysteriously caught fire. The fire had destroyed all the experimental equipment, all the research data, and all the evidence of illegal human experimentation. It had also killed every patient who could have testified about what had been done to them. The fire hadn't been an accident. It had been arson, committed to cover up medical crimes. As I read through the documents, I found something that made my blood run cold. A memo from Dr. Harrison dated March 14, 1973, one day before the fire. Research program termination scheduled for March 16th. All experimental subjects must be neutralized before investigation begins. Fire suppression systems in research wing to be disabled during overnight maintenance window. Electrical fire origin recommended to ensure complete destruction of evidence. Dr. Harrison had murdered 47 people to cover up his illegal experiments. And for 50 years, the truth had been buried with his victims. But now, they were back. I continued reading and found another document that explained why I was the only one who could see them. Among Dr. Harrison's experimental subjects was a pregnant woman named Louise Walsh. According to his notes, she had been unknowingly given an experimental drug that was supposed to accelerate healing after surgery. But the drug had unexpected effects. It had somehow created a genetic marker that would be passed on to her descendants, a marker that made them sensitive to spiritual energy. My grandmother had been experimented on while she was pregnant with my father. That experimentation had given me the ability to see the spirits of Dr. Harrison's victims, and they had been waiting 50 years for someone with that ability to help them expose the truth. As I sat in the medical library, surrounded by evidence of the most horrific medical crimes I could imagine, I realized that the patients who had appeared in our ER weren't just seeking medical treatment. They were seeking justice. But I also realized that someone at Memorial Hospital knew about Dr. Harrison's crimes and had been working to keep them covered up, because some of the documents I was reading had been updated recently. Someone was still actively protecting Dr. Harrison's legacy. And that someone knew I had discovered the truth. The sound of footsteps in the medical library made me freeze. It was 4:30 a.m., and I was the only one who should have been in this section of the hospital. I quickly gathered up Dr. Harrison's files and tried to look like I was doing routine research, but my heart was pounding as someone approached. "Jennifer, what are you doing here?" It was Dr. Robert Martinez, Memorial Hospital's chief of staff. Dr. Martinez had been working at Memorial for over 30 years, and he was one of the most respected physicians in Denver. "Dr. Martinez," I said, trying to sound casual. "I was just researching burn treatment protocols. We had an unusual number of burn victims tonight." Dr. Martinez's expression shifted slightly. "Unusual how?" "Just more severe than typical house fire injuries. I wanted to review best practices for extensive burn care." Dr. Martinez nodded, but his eyes were focused on the files I was holding. "Jennifer, those are very old files. I don't think they'll be relevant to current treatment protocols. I was just curious about the history of burn treatment at Memorial, learning how far we've come since the 1970s. The 1970s were a difficult time for this hospital," Dr. Martinez said carefully. "The fire in 1973 was a tragedy that changed everything about how we approach patient safety. I've been reading about that fire. It seems like there were some unusual circumstances." Dr. Martinez's demeanor became noticeably more tense. "Jennifer, I think you should focus on current medical protocols rather than historical events. The past is the past." "But Dr. Martinez, if we don't learn from the past, how can we prevent similar tragedies?" "Some tragedies are better left forgotten," he said firmly. "I suggest you return those files to archives and focus on your current patients." P.O. As Dr. Martinez walked away, I realized I had just encountered someone who knew about Dr. Harrison's crimes and wanted them to stay buried. But I also realized that I couldn't let the 47 victims of the 1973 fire remain voiceless. I made copies of the most damning documents and then returned the original files to archives. For the rest of my shift, I couldn't stop thinking about what I had learned. My grandmother hadn't just died in a fire. She had been murdered to cover up illegal medical experimentation. And the experimentation performed on her while she was pregnant had given me the ability to see the spirits of Dr. Harrison's other victims. When my shift ended at 7 a.m., I drove to the cemetery where my grandmother was buried. I had visited her grave many times over the years, but this time felt different. As I stood beside her headstone, I spoke to her directly. "Grandma Louise, I know you're here. I know what really happened to you, and I promise I'm going to make sure everyone knows the truth." A warm breeze moved through the cemetery, even though the morning was still and calm, and I swear I heard my grandmother's voice whisper, "Thank you, Jennifer." That evening, I returned to work determined to help the fire victims find justice. But when I arrived at the ER, I discovered that I wasn't the only one who knew about the 1973 fire. Dr. Chen approached me as I was starting my shift. "Jennifer, Dr. Martinez asked me to speak with you about last night's patients." "What about them?" "He's concerned that you might be experiencing some kind of stress reaction. He said you seemed confused about the timeline of events, that you were asking unusual questions about historical incidents." "Dr. Chen, those patients last night weren't from a recent house fire. They were from the 1973 Memorial Hospital fire." Dr. Chen looked at me with genuine concern. Jennifer, that's impossible. The 1973 fire happened 50 years ago. Those people are dead. I know they're dead, but they came back. Jennifer, I think you need to take some time off. Maybe talk to someone about what you're experiencing. I realized that Dr. Chen genuinely couldn't see what I was seeing. To her, the fire victims looked like normal, contemporary patients. But I also realized that Dr. Martinez had specifically asked her to monitor me. Someone at Memorial Hospital was trying to discredit me before I could expose the truth. Dr. Chen, what if I could prove that those patients were from 1973? How could you possibly prove something like that? Their identification, their clothing, their medical knowledge, everything about them is from 50 years ago. Jennifer, trauma patients often have confused memories. Their identification could have been damaged in the fire. There are logical explanations for everything you're noticing. But that night, as if to prove my point, more fire victims began arriving. And this time, I was ready to document everything. I had my phone, I had copies of the historical records, and I had the names and details of every person who had died in the 1973 fire. When the first patient arrived at 11 p.m., I was prepared to prove that these weren't contemporary burn victims. But what I discovered that night would prove that the conspiracy to cover up Dr. Harrison's crimes went much deeper than I had imagined, and that some people would kill to keep the truth buried. The patient who arrived at 11 p.m. that second night was a young man named Michael Torres. According to the 1973 fire records, Michael had been 23 years old when he died. As I was treating his burns, Michael grabbed my arm with desperate strength. "Nurse, you have to listen to me. Doctor. Harrison isn't who he says he is. The medication he's giving us, it's not helping us heal. It's making us sicker." "What kind of medication?" "He calls it Compound X47. He says it's going to revolutionize medicine. But I've seen what it does to people. Mrs. Rodriguez started having seizures after the first dose. Mr. Thompson's kidneys stopped working. And little Sarah, she was only 8 years old." Michael started crying. "Doctor, Harrison said the fire was an accident, but I saw him in the hallway with a gas can. He started the fire on purpose." "Michael, where did you see Dr. Harrison with the gas can?" "In the research wing, right before the alarms started going off. He was pouring gasoline on the floor and walls. When he saw me watching, he looked angry, like he'd been caught doing something wrong." "What happened next?" "He told me to go back to my room and not tell anyone what I'd seen. But then the fire started spreading so fast, the doors were locked. We couldn't get out." As Michael spoke, I noticed that Dr. Martinez was standing near the nurses' station, watching us intently. I finished treating Michael's burns and then went to find a private place where I could document his testimony. But as I was walking to the break room, Dr. Martinez intercepted me. "Jennifer, I need to speak with you privately." He led me to his office and closed the door. "Jennifer, I understand you've been researching the 1973 fire." "Yes, I have. And I understand you believe there's some connection between that historical event and recent patients." "Dr. Martinez, the patients I've been treating are the actual victims of the 1973 fire. They've come back to expose what really happened." Dr. Martinez sat down heavily in his chair. For a long moment, he was quiet. Then he said something that made my blood run cold. "Jennifer, what would you say if I told you that I know exactly what happened in 1973? "I'd say you need to help me make sure the truth comes out." "And what if I told you that some truths are too dangerous to reveal?" I felt my heart start racing. "What do you mean?" Dr. Martinez opened a file cabinet and pulled out a folder that looked identical to the ones I'd found in the archives. Dr. Edward Harrison wasn't working alone in 1973. His illegal experiments were part of a larger research program funded by pharmaceutical companies and government agencies. The goal was to develop drugs that could enhance human healing and recovery. That doesn't justify experimenting on patients without their consent. No, it doesn't. But when Dr. Harrison's experiments started killing people, the decision was made to end the program and eliminate all evidence, including the patients. Dr. Martinez showed me documents that proved the fire had been intentionally set by a team of people, not just Dr. Harrison acting alone. Jennifer, Memorial Hospital has spent 50 years building a reputation as one of the finest medical facilities in the region. We've saved thousands of lives, advanced medical research, contributed to the community in countless ways. But you did it by covering up murder. We did it by choosing to focus on the future instead of dwelling on past mistakes. Those weren't mistakes. They were crimes. Dr. Martinez leaned forward. Jennifer, what do you think would happen if this information became public? Memorial Hospital would be destroyed. Hundreds of current employees would lose their jobs. Thousands of patients would lose access to quality medical care. The damage would be incalculable. And the 47 people who were murdered. Don't they deserve justice? They deserve to rest in peace. And the best way to honor their memory is to ensure that Memorial Hospital continues to save lives. I realized that Dr. Martinez was offering me a choice: keep quiet about what I discovered, or face the consequences of exposing the truth. What if I refuse to stay quiet? Then you'll discover that some accidents are more convenient than others. The threat was clear. If I tried to expose the truth about the 1973 fire, I would be silenced permanently. But as I sat in Dr. Martinez's office, I thought about my grandmother Louise, about Michael Torres, about all the other victims who had been murdered to protect Dr. Harrison's secrets. And I realized that some things are more important than personal safety. Dr. Martinez, I can't ignore what I've learned. Those patients came back for a reason. They want justice. Jennifer, I'm disappointed to hear that. I had hoped we could reach an understanding. Dr. Martinez picked up his phone and made a call. Security? I need an escort for a staff member who's experiencing a psychological emergency. Yes, immediately. I realized I was about to be forcibly removed from the hospital and probably committed for psychiatric evaluation. But I also realized that the fire victims hadn't just come back to expose the truth to me. They had come back to reclaim their power. As security guards entered Dr. Martinez's office, the lights began to flicker. The temperature in the room dropped noticeably, and the smell of smoke began to fill the air. "What's happening?" Dr. Martinez asked, looking around nervously. That's when I saw them. All 47 victims of the 1973 fire were standing in Dr. Martinez's office. They filled the room, their burn injuries visible, their faces filled with determination and righteous anger. And leading them was my grandmother Louise. "Dr. Martinez," I said calmly, "I think it's time you met the patients you've been trying to keep quiet for 50 years. The security guards couldn't see the spirits, but they could feel the presence. They backed away from the door, confused and frightened. Dr. Martinez was staring at empty air, but I could see the terror in his eyes as he sensed something he couldn't understand. "Jennifer, what's happening? What are you doing?" "I'm not doing anything, but they are." The fire victims began to speak all at once, telling their stories, demanding justice, insisting that the truth be revealed. And I realized that my role wasn't just to expose the truth. It was to help 47 murdered souls find the peace they had been denied for 50 years. But first, we had to make sure that no one else would ever be silenced to protect Memorial Hospital's secrets. The presence of 47 angry spirits in Dr. Martinez's office created an atmosphere of supernatural terror that even people who couldn't see them could feel. The security guards were backing away from the door, their hands shaking as they tried to understand why the room had suddenly become freezing cold and filled with the smell of smoke. Dr. Martinez was pressed against the wall behind his desk, his face pale with fear, as he sensed presences he couldn't see but somehow knew were there. "Jennifer," he whispered, "make them go away." "I can't make them go away, Dr. Martinez. They've been waiting 50 years for someone to listen to them. And now they're here to make sure the truth comes out." My grandmother Louise stepped forward from the group of spirits. When she spoke, her voice was clear and strong, filled with the authority of someone who had endured decades of injustice. "Dr. Martinez, you have spent 50 years protecting the people who murdered us. You have allowed Dr. Harrison's crimes to remain hidden, while building your career on the foundation of our deaths." "Doctor." Martinez couldn't hear her words, but he seemed to sense their meaning. He was trembling as he looked around the room. "Jennifer, what do they want?" "They want justice. They want the truth about Dr. Harrison's experiments to be revealed. They want the families who lost loved ones to know what really happened. That's impossible. It would destroy the hospital. Then maybe the hospital deserves to be destroyed. Michael Torres stepped forward from the group of spirits. Dr. Martinez, I was 23 years old when Dr. Harrison murdered me. I had a fiancé, a job, a future. Dr. Harrison took all of that away because I witnessed him starting the fire. Dorothy Martinez joined him. I was a mother of 3 children. Dr. Harrison told me the experimental medication would help me recover faster so I could get home to my family. Instead, it made me sicker, and when I started asking questions, he decided I was a liability. One by one, each of the 47 fire victims began to tell their stories. They spoke about the illegal experiments, about the lies they were told, about the suffering they endured, about the terror they felt when they realized Dr. Harrison intended to kill them all. As they spoke, the supernatural energy in the room intensified. The lights flickered more violently. The windows began to rattle. Papers on Dr. Martinez's desk started moving as if blown by an invisible wind. Dr. Martinez was now cowering behind his desk, unable to see the spirits but overwhelmed by their presence. Jennifer, please make them stop. Dr. Martinez, they'll stop when justice is served, when the truth comes out, when the families of the victims know what really happened to their loved ones. I can't do that. The legal implications alone would bankrupt the hospital. The lawsuits, the criminal investigations, the media attention. It would destroy everything we've built. That's when my grandmother spoke directly to me. Jennifer, Dr. Martinez isn't the only one who's been protecting Dr. Harrison's secrets. There are others, board members, administrators, people who have known the truth for decades. Who else, Grandma Louise? Dr. Harrison's son, Edward Harrison Jr., is currently the head of pharmaceutical research at Denver General Hospital. He's been using his father's research data to develop new drugs, profiting from experiments that killed 47 people. I felt a surge of anger. Not only had the original crimes been covered up, but Dr. Harrison's legacy was still generating profits for his family. Dr. Martinez, is that true? Is Dr. Harrison's son still using the research data from the illegal experiments? Dr. Martinez's silence was answer enough. Jennifer, you don't understand the complexity of the situation. The research data has led to legitimate medical breakthroughs, drugs that have saved thousands of lives. Are you willing to sacrifice all of those future patients for the sake of people who died 50 years ago? The spirits in the room responded to Dr. Martinez's words with visible anger. The supernatural energy became so intense that the security guards fled the office entirely. Dr. Martinez, I said, those people didn't die. They were murdered. And their murders have been covered up for 5 decades, while their killers and their killers' families profited from their deaths. Suddenly, the fire alarm began blaring throughout the hospital. But there was no fire. The spirits of the 1973 fire victims were triggering the alarm system to get everyone's attention. Jennifer, my grandmother said, it's time to finish this. The truth needs to come out tonight. I understood what she meant. The fire victims had waited 50 years for justice. They weren't going to wait any longer. Dr. Martinez, you have a choice. You can help me reveal the truth about the 1973 fire, or the spirits of the victims will make sure the truth comes out in other ways. What do you mean? As if to answer his question, the computers in his office began turning on by themselves. The screens displayed documents about Dr. Harrison's experiments, medical records of the fire victims, and financial records showing payments made to cover up the crimes. They're going to reveal everything themselves, I said. Every computer in the hospital, every electronic system, every communication device, they're going to use all of it to broadcast the truth, unless you help me do it the right way. Dr. Martinez looked around his office as more computers began displaying incriminating documents. The supernatural energy was now affecting the entire hospital's electronic systems. What do you want me to do? Call a press conference. Invite the families of the 1973 fire victims. Publicly acknowledge what really happened and apologize for 50 years of cover-up. Jennifer, I can't do that. The board of directors would never approve. Before he could finish his sentence, every phone in the hospital began ringing simultaneously. When staff members answered, they heard the voices of the fire victims telling their stories, explaining how they had been murdered, demanding justice. The hospital's public address system activated, and Michael Torres's voice echoed through every hallway. My name is Michael Torres. I was murdered on March 15, 1973, by Dr. Edward Harrison to cover up illegal medical experiments. Memorial Hospital has hidden this truth for 50 years. Other voices joined in. Dorothy Martinez, Louise Walsh, all 47 victims speaking simultaneously through the hospital's communication systems. Dr. Martinez was panicking. Jennifer, make them stop. This will destroy us. Then help me give them what they want. Recognition, acknowledgement, justice. Fine. I'll call a press conference, but I need you to make them stop disrupting the hospital systems. I looked at my grandmother. Grandma Louise, if Dr. Martinez agrees to tell the truth publicly, will you and the others stop the disruption? Only if he tells the complete truth, Jennifer. No more lies, no more cover-ups, no more protecting the people who profited from our deaths. I turned back to Dr. Martinez. You have to reveal everything. Dr. Harrison's experiments, the intentional fire, the cover-up, the ongoing profits from the research data, everything. Dr. Martinez nodded desperately. Yes, I'll reveal everything. Just make them stop. As soon as he agreed, the supernatural activity ceased. The phones stopped ringing, the computers returned to normal, the PA system went quiet. But the fire victims didn't disappear. They remained in the office, watching Dr. Martinez with expressions that made it clear they would be monitoring his every move. Dr. Martinez, I said, you need to understand that this isn't just about the past. If you don't follow through on your promise, if you try to minimize or cover up anything, they'll be back. I understand. I'll schedule the press conference for tomorrow morning. And you'll contact the families of all 47 victims personally? Yes? And you'll provide full financial compensation for their families? Yes. And you'll ensure that Dr. Edward Harrison Jr. faces criminal charges for profiting from his father's crimes? Dr. Martinez hesitated. Jennifer, I can't control what happens to people outside this hospital. The temperature in the room immediately dropped again, and the smell of smoke returned. Yes, Dr. Martinez said quickly. I'll make sure all responsible parties face appropriate consequences. My grandmother stepped forward one more time. Jennifer, tell Dr. Martinez that we will be watching. If he breaks his promise, if he tries to minimize the truth or protect the guilty, we will return. And next time, we won't be as patient. I relayed the message to Dr. Martinez, who nodded frantically. I understand. I won't break my promise. As Dr. Martinez began making phone calls to arrange the press conference, the fire victims began to fade from the room, but my grandmother remained visible for a few moments longer. Jennifer, thank you for giving us a voice. Thank you for refusing to let us be forgotten. Grandma Louise, what happens to you now? Do you find peace? Now that the truth will finally come out, now that justice will be served, we can rest. But we'll always be watching over you, sweetheart. You did something incredibly brave tonight. I love you, Grandma. I love you too. And I'm so proud of the woman you've become. With those words, my grandmother faded away, and I was alone with Dr. Martinez. Over the next several hours, Dr. Martinez made dozens of phone calls. He contacted local news stations, reached out to the families of fire victims, and began the process of scheduling what would become one of the most significant press conferences in Denver medical history. But I also knew that the real work was just beginning. Revealing the truth about the 1973 fire would have consequences that stretched far beyond Memorial Hospital. And I was about to learn that some people would do anything to prevent 50-year-old secrets from seeing the light of day. The press conference took place at 10 a.m. the following morning in Memorial Hospital's main auditorium. The room was packed with reporters, family members of fire victims, hospital staff, and community leaders. Dr. Martinez took the podium looking like a man who hadn't slept in days. His hands were shaking as he began to speak. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm here today to make a public acknowledgement about events that took place at the original Memorial Hospital on March 15, 1973. As he spoke, I could see several of the fire victims standing in the back of the auditorium, invisible to everyone else but watching to ensure that the truth was finally told. For 50 years, Memorial Hospital has maintained that the fire, which claimed 47 lives, was a tragic accident caused by electrical problems. Today, I'm here to tell you that this was not true. A murmur of shock rippled through the audience. Dr. Martinez continued, his voice growing stronger as he committed to telling the complete truth. The fire was deliberately set by Dr. Edward Harrison, who was conducting illegal medical experiments on patients without their knowledge or consent. When hospital administration discovered these experiments and planned to report Dr. Harrison to federal authorities, he chose to destroy all evidence of his crimes, including the patients who could testify against him. The room erupted in gasps and angry voices. Several family members of fire victims began crying as they learned the truth about how their loved ones had really died. The 47 people who died in that fire were not victims of an accident. They were murder victims. And Memorial Hospital has spent 50 years covering up these crimes to protect our reputation and avoid legal consequences. Dr. Martinez went on to provide specific details about Dr. Harrison's experiments, the cover-up that followed, and the ongoing efforts to suppress the truth. He also announced that Memorial Hospital would be providing financial compensation to all victim families and that the hospital would cooperate fully with any criminal investigations that resulted from these revelations. When Dr. Martinez finished speaking, the questions from reporters were immediate and intense. Dr. Martinez, how long have you personally known about these crimes? I've known since I started working here 30 years ago. I was told that the information was classified and that revealing it would damage the hospital's ability to serve the community. Are there other people who have been covering up these crimes? Yes. Several board members, former administrators, and external parties have been involved in maintaining the cover-up. What about Dr. Harrison's son, Edward Harrison Jr.? Has he profited from his father's research? Dr. Martinez hesitated for a moment, then answered truthfully. Yes. Dr. Harrison Jr. has been using research data from his father's illegal experiments to develop pharmaceutical products. He has personally profited from drugs that were developed using information gained through the murder of 47 people. After the press conference, I was approached by Maria Santos, whose Aunt Dorothy Martinez had been one of the fire victims. Nurse Walsh, I wanted to thank you personally. My family has spent 50 years wondering what really happened to Aunt Dorothy. She was supposed to be recovering from routine surgery, but she died in what we were told was an accidental fire. I'm so sorry for your loss. And I'm sorry it took 50 years for the truth to come out. How did you know? How did you discover what really happened? I couldn't tell her that her aunt had returned from the dead to expose the truth, so I simply said, I found inconsistencies in the medical records and decided to investigate. But Maria surprised me with her next words. My grandmother always said that Aunt Dorothy visited her in dreams, telling her that she hadn't died in an accident. My grandmother insisted that Dorothy was trying to tell us something important, but we thought it was just grief making her imagine things. Maybe your grandmother was right. Maybe she was. Over the following weeks, the revelations about the 1973 fire had far-reaching consequences. The Denver District Attorney opened a criminal investigation into the cover-up, leading to charges against several former hospital administrators. Dr. Edward Harrison Jr. was arrested and charged with profiting from criminal activity. The pharmaceutical company he worked for faced federal investigation and massive lawsuits. Memorial Hospital faced hundreds of millions of dollars in lawsuits from victim families, ultimately leading to a settlement that provided substantial compensation to all affected families. But more importantly, the 47 victims of Dr. Harrison's crimes were finally acknowledged and honored. Memorial Hospital erected a memorial garden with a plaque listing all the victims' names and acknowledging that they had been murdered, not killed in an accidental fire. Every March 15th, the hospital now holds a memorial service to honor the victims and recommit to ethical medical practices. As for me, the experience changed everything about how I approach my work as a nurse. I learned that healthcare providers have a responsibility that goes beyond treating current patients. We also have an obligation to ensure that medical crimes are exposed and that victims are not forgotten. I became an advocate for medical transparency and patient rights. I work with organizations that investigate potential medical abuse and help expose cover-ups. But most importantly, I learned about the power of family connections that transcend death. My grandmother Louise had been waiting 50 years for someone in our family to help her and the other victims find justice. She had passed on to me a genetic sensitivity that allowed me to see spirits, not as a curse, but as a gift that enabled me to serve justice. 6 months after the press conference, I visited my grandmother's grave again. This time, I brought flowers and a copy of the newspaper article about the criminal charges against Dr. Harrison Jr. "Grandma Louise," I said, "justice has been served. The truth is out. All 47 victims have been honored and remembered." I felt a warm presence around me, and I knew that my grandmother and the other victims had finally found peace. But I also felt something else, a sense of purpose and connection that would guide me for the rest of my life. The dead don't always rest in peace naturally. Sometimes they need the living to help them find justice. Sometimes they need family members to speak for them when they can no longer speak for themselves. And sometimes, the most important thing a healthcare provider can do is remember that every patient is someone's family member, someone's loved one, someone who deserves to be treated with dignity and honesty. Memorial Hospital is still operating today, but it's a very different institution than it was before the truth came out. The hospital now has some of the strictest ethical oversight policies in the country. Every research project is subject to multiple levels of review. Patient advocacy groups have permanent representation on the board of directors. And every new employee, from doctors to maintenance staff, receives training about the 1973 fire and the importance of medical ethics. The hospital that was built on a foundation of murder and cover-up has been transformed into an institution committed to transparency and justice. But the most important change is that the 47 victims of Dr. Harrison's crimes are no longer forgotten. Their names are displayed prominently in the hospital lobby. Their stories are told to every new employee. Their memory serves as a constant reminder that medical authority must never be used to harm the vulnerable. If you work in healthcare, remember the story of the 1973 Memorial Hospital fire. Remember that patients trust us with their lives, and that trust is sacred. Remember that covering up medical crimes doesn't protect anyone. It only enables more crimes. And remember that sometimes the dead return not to frighten us, but to remind us of our obligations to the living. My grandmother Louise and the other 46 victims of Dr. Harrison's experiments finally found peace when the truth was revealed. But their legacy lives on in every ethical decision made by healthcare providers who refuse to prioritize institutional interests over patient welfare. Every time a healthcare worker speaks up about potential abuse, every time a researcher refuses to compromise patient safety, every time a hospital administrator chooses transparency over cover-up, the spirits of those 47 victims are honored. Because the most important lesson they taught me is this: the truth may be buried, but it never dies. Justice may be delayed, but it never disappears. And love, especially the love between family members, can transcend death itself to ensure that wrongs are righted and that the innocent are remembered. Thank you, Grandma Louise, for waiting 50 years for me to help you. Thank you for giving me the ability to see the truth. And thank you for teaching me that some fights are worth everything, even when the odds seem impossible. Rest in peace, all 47 of you. Your voices have been heard, your stories have been told, and your justice has finally been served.